and welcome to Optics, where we watch socially impactful documentary shorts and speak with the filmmakers, artists, and activists who made them. I'm your host, Barry Thornburg. The film we're watching today is Flat, by me. Hi. And joining us today is our special guest, Dr. Gabriel Cruz. He's a media scholar, and he's here to discuss conspiracy theories. Let me get him queued up here. Welcome, Gabriel.
Hi, Barry.
Well, okay, so something I wanted to do, usually I have questions for the filmmaker. You're not the filmmaker, I am, and so to try and start this discussion off, I think I want to highlight kind of why I feel like this film is socially relevant to us. To me, it's pretty clear, but sometimes we might feel like, why? What's with the flat Earth, and why do we care? Other than like a few years ago, it kind of bubbled up to pop culture status. Like, why do we care about flat Earth today? Any thoughts on that?
Actually, that's what I was going to ask you to begin with, is because, of all the conspiracy theories to choose from, in particular, my favorite of like mattress firms and things like that, why this? What is the sort of relevance, and what does this tell us as a truth that has been debunked many times over for hundreds of years, right? But that people seem to have latched onto.
Yeah, so I really feel like, the thing that captured my interest was the psychology behind it. Not so much the topic itself, though the topic itself and what you just outlined is definitely part of the interest in my mind. It plays into the psychology, though. Like, part of our human history, part of our collective human history here in the West, at least, but I know it's much further reaching than that. But I'm only familiar with the West in general. We kind of have this shared understanding of the Earth and the history of our understanding of it. Not just the history of it, but like we've been taught in subtle and overt ways how we've learned about the world we live in and the universe that it resides within, right? And so to have someone within this society to take a stand and say all of that is a lie, or all of that is fake, or we are completely misunderstanding reality, I think is really fascinating to me. It's bold in its own way, but it also puts... I think one reason why it resonates so much with people is that it puts us on the spot and causes us to have to try and like think about like, well, how do I actually explain this thing that I've never needed to explain ever?
Sure.
Everything I know about this thing has been part of how I navigate life, right? Like how I know the Earth is shaped determines how I understand how we travel and so on. And so like I've never needed to explain that, though. So how do I explain that to someone who rejects it altogether, throws it out completely? And what I found, and it's something that I capture a little bit in the film, is that we are generally really terrible at explaining that. Like, the general populace has not been given the tools to be able to actually prove the roundness of the Earth, and
right.
So it's rather difficult, and we do a poor job at trying to counteract the flat Earth conspiracy for that reason. I would say. So I don't know. I think that's one side of it, but I think why it's relevant to us, even if we don't care about flat earthers. Let's say there's only 5 in the entire world. Who cares? What I think is relevant is that the same tools that are necessary for developing an adherence to flat Earth conspiracy are the same tools that are used for other conspiracies. Like, there's very little that's unique about the thought process that it takes to gravitate towards flat earth and believing in it and so on. And we see it in very subtle ways in other things, and very strong ways in some things. Like the anti-vax movement is very heavily engaged in media consumption and fact finding in the same methodology that flat earthers engage in all of that. And so less important to me is the specific topic of flat earth, and more so
Sure.
like why it can exist in general, because it explains so much more about how other things exist as well.
Absolutely. And I really like the point that you made about our difficulty with explaining things, right? Because this is one of those things that most of us are not technically trained in, how to measure, whether or not the earth is flat or round, that kind of thing. We don't develop the skill sets. And if you're anything like myself, you probably slept through most of your algebra classes. So any possibility that's out the window. But it's also, and I say this as someone who grew up in the South and has had to sort of contend with like the lost cause myths and things like that. When you grow up in a environment of, well, of course, knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is, of course, this way. Well, of course it is, because people told us, and this, that, and the other. And then when you go to sort of break away from that skepticism, and you don't have the tools to research, right? Like, maybe having, in some cases of like history and that sort of stuff in the Civil War, access to libraries or diaries or research materials, and that's this, that, and the other, you kind of come up with your own stuff. And the problem with creating your own explanations is you then become that metric, and that is not a good way to do things, right? That is the value of the scientific method, is that it is a external metric that exists whether I agree with what the findings are. When I get to set those goalposts, well, then I can just put them wherever I want. And unfortunately, that is sort of like the part B of critical thinking, right? It's good to be skeptical. It's good to be thoughtful and ask questions about things. But then how do you go about filling in those answers? Because if you don't have a externally verifiable method of doing so, boy, you come to some wild conclusions, right?
Yeah. I mean, that point that you make about it's good to ask questions. I find that one of the tactics, or whether it's intended or not, I'm not about to try and dissect intent here, but one of the methods for questioning that is typical conspiracy thinking is to raise the question without ever intending to actually answer it. Mm-hmm. You raise the question instead so that you can insert your answer. Mm-hmm. And we have so much confidence in ourselves that obviously I don't need to think beyond what I already know or what I assume to understand. My answer is the answer because it makes sense to me.
Sure.
And so, but I'm going to ask these questions. I'm going to ask, well, is NASA honest in how they present their information? Mm-hmm. And that's a great question to ask. I actually think that's a really valid question. We should wonder how honest is NASA? But sure. If we only raise the question so that it casts doubt on NASA, and that's the sole purpose of it, then okay, now we're just leading into our own conclusions. We want to believe that they don't tell the truth. I for one, gravitate towards thinking that large institutions inherently lie. Like that's part of me for sure. But at the same time, like that's also a really dangerous way to navigate the world, to just automatically assume that I'm being lied to by anything that's got a a branding element to it,
Absolutely. And to that point, and you referenced earlier, I am a media scholar, and of course there's a lot of distrust in media as an institution, right? And journalism and those sort of practices, the idea of, well, we know that they've gotten things wrong before, and are they telling us accurate information, or are they manipulating us, that kind of thing. One of my favorite examples to point to is actually Rolling Stone magazine, which a few years ago reported on a case of sexual assault at the University of Virginia, only to find out after they ran the story that it was entirely fabricated. It was something involving, fraternities and, drinking culture on campuses and that kind of stuff. And it was this egregious story, only to determine later that it was in fact entirely fabricated. And people will say, oh well, that's an example of the media lying to us or manipulating something and going along with like this dominant narrative and this, that, and the other, and trying to slander frats and that kind of thing. But a closer look at it finds that, well, yes, they were wrong, but they were wrong because they didn't adhere to journalistic integrity practices, right, that are standards. And so often when we find moments of institutional malpractice, so to speak, it's because they often betray the standards that they set. So when they do the right thing, they're doing the right thing, right? Those cases aren't because they necessarily moved the goalpost intentionally. It's because someone just messed up along the way. In the case of the Rolling Stones UVA case, they didn't do like the secondary and tertiary confirmation that they should have done, that most journalistic institutions do, right? So, and there's a distinction there between malintent versus not adhering to practices and protocols that are supposed to keep us honest.
And that's not to say that, like, for the specific example that you're giving, that's not to say that we should just accept whatever Rolling Stone puts out until
Absolutely.
It's disproven. Like,
absolutely,
we should be skeptical, absolutely, and we should be worried about making sure that journalists of all flavors are actually trying to present factual information that is verifiable and so on. It's funny though, because one mess up or one instance where people actually might have had ill intent. If we use that as the way to paint the entirety of everything thereafter, it's an easy way to navigate that situation, very easy, but it's not always the most helpful, because then where do you go?
Exactly. And so if you like throw out all media institutions and you, so to speak, throw out the baby with the bathwater, you're losing a lot of really good practices that if we just adhered to would serve the common good. Right. Absolutely. I mean, like if we distrust NASA so much and we're going to just, disregard what all they say, are we also throwing out all the science and technology they've developed over the last, however many decades? Right. What else are we getting rid of with that? It's not. It's a matter of using a scalpel as opposed to a hacksaw when it comes to solving the problem. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I want to point out an article. It relates to what we're talking about. A guy by the name of Sebastian Mallaby wrote a very wonderful and very articulate article in The Guardian in 2016 called Alan Greenspan, or here, let me... The Cult of the Expert and How It Collapsed. And he centers the narrative around Alan Greenspan, and he's focused on the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and kind of the ups and downs of the Federal Reserve politically in terms of who had power over that institution. And bringing that back around to what we're talking about, he really breaks down in an interesting way the ways in which an expert has power or loses his or her power, depending on how the expert behaves, as well as how the political climate that they exist within behaves as well. And what he found was that through experts have been used in government institutions in the United States on and off, and this is true of other countries as well, but the article focuses on the United States, obviously. And at some points there's a political movement that says, well, we didn't elect the expert, we didn't elect this economist to run our economy, so why on earth would we empower this individual to go and make these huge decisions that impact everyone in very dramatic ways? But then the pendulum will swing the other way, and there will be times where we say, these elected officials, the people that we elected, are not economists. They have no idea how to run things.
Sure.
Like, how do they know how to actually make sure that our economy is healthy and running strong? And so we then kind of get tired of the elected official and their shenanigans and politicizing every little move and decision. And we instead really just, out of that exhaustion, say, look, okay, you take it. You know, I want this person who knows how to run these huge complex systems to just do it. I'm tired. But then that it ebbs and flows. And I see that in kind of the way that, if we're talking about flat earth specifically, but many conspiracy theories revolve around a body of science, if not the scientific community as a whole, right? And so we look at science as a bunch of experts who have extremely large amounts of influence over the way we do things, right? And scientific exploration will lead us to conclude all sorts of things that a decade ago, 5 years ago, last year, last century was considered heresy, right? Or you know, like, that's just not the way society worked. And so hence the culture war that we claim to be in. And I find this article, The Cult of the Expert and How It Collapsed, interesting only in its parallels to this discussion about conspiracy, because not only do we have to question the institutions that run things, we have to start, in order for these conspiracies to be true, we have to start bringing it down and narrowing it down to the individual people who call themselves experts on any given topic. And we have to find a way to chink at their armor, so to speak, right? To call into question, do they actually know what they claim to know, or is there something else behind it?
I think that's a really good point. It's unfortunate that we often see expertise misapplied. So I talk about this in my classes where, you know, we go over matters of credibility and you know, how to, knowing who to cite and when and that kind of thing when you're doing research and what have you. And so, for example, as a, we'll say, hypothetical situation, if in the government, an individual who was like really good at something, like a very prominent brain surgeon who's really good at one thing he does, right? Were then to be put in charge of, I don't know, like how the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we might say, well, you know, he's a really smart guy and he knows how to do this one thing really well. Can we really, though, trust that he knows much about this other thing that he's been putting into, right? How much does brain surgery overlap with things like infrastructure and urban planning?
Right.
Because maybe you don't know anything about it, and that has implications and concerns. But it's not just enough to question that choice. I mean, certainly it's good, right? But it goes to that idea of how do you then follow through on it? Okay, well, what kind of expertise should they have? And you know, it's like I tell all my students, look, I'm a doctor, but don't take medical advice from me. I am not that kind of doctor.
Right. There is a compartmentalization of expertise, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, I don't know, there's calls for things like science literacy or media literacy to try and combat the misinformation that is actively out there, right? This tendency we have to make assumptions and to kind of cascade into conspiratorial thinking. And I say we, because I mean collectively, that's kind of how we function as a people. Like, to stop that from happening takes a concerted effort. Everyone is vulnerable to the same thinking. Like, I forgot where I was going with that.
If I might dovetail onto that.
Yeah, go for it.
When you get into this sort of conspiratorial thinking, one of the things that I'm really interested in as a researcher is this idea of narrative and how we use stories to construct a world that makes sense for us in the absence of evidence and facts based off of our own experiences. And I'll give you an example. When we talk about like the scientific community, for example, right, and skepticism of NASA, on a much smaller level, we might talk about like the opioid epidemic on an interpersonal micro level. So, for example, a lot of us know someone who has had a negative experience with a medical doctor, right? They weren't taken seriously when they were reporting something, or they felt like they were being given medicine that maybe they didn't need, or prescribed, in some cases, like opioids when there were other alternatives, only to find that out after the fact. And it's hard to know the intent of the doctor at the time. Maybe they thought they did the right thing or not. But either way, in the personal experience, it becomes interpreted as I went to an expert and they took advantage of me, right? And so then you have that narrative in your mind, and that narrative is rooted in some degree of reality and personal experience, however true it may or may not be, right? It's true for that person. So then
Right.
the idea of, well, NASA's been telling us this sort of thing forever, and how do I know I can trust them? Because this other person who's supposed to have like this investment in my life was wrong, and they have, especially if I get like a second opinion somewhere else, they're like, no, that shouldn't have happened. The doctor shouldn't have wrote you that script. Um, that distrust is already there of an institution related to science, and because so many of us are not medically trained and don't have the science literacy to understand in the moment, then when we come to another area of science and research and institutions, that kind of stuff, and we're like, okay, well, what about them? Maybe. I mean, yeah, I'm supposed to believe that the world is round, but again, maybe they're taking advantage of us, because that's a universally human motivation, right? Manipulation and taking advantage from positions of power. So again, in the absence of evidence, we create a story that makes sense to us because we kind of have to make sense of the world around us,
Right.
which I
Right.
find endlessly fascinating and also really depressing.
I think about I mean, what the thing that I came across so often with my research in the making of this film, and I even had to continue my research even through the making of the film, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't like, you know, unjustly canceling things out, or I just wanted to
Sure.
make sure that I was getting it right. But um, the Dunning-Kruger effect was
Hmm.
a psychological concept that came up again and again. That being, for viewers, that basically the more confidence you have in yourself, the more vulnerable you are to actually performing less adequately at the thing that you are very confident in, right? Your
Hmm.
own confidence prevents you from scrutinizing your own abilities. So
Hmm.
the classic example is students, for example, students who are highly confident in themselves and think that they are very good at whatever given material that they're studying, actually end up scoring lower on exams and performing within that field at a lower quality than students who feel a sense of inadequacy, but are still motivated to work hard to like try and master it. So the ones who don't feel like they mastered it actually score higher on exams and perform better in that field of choice, whatever it may be. But those who feel super confident about it and know that they're really good at it, often fail to see their own inadequacies. And oftentimes I see that in the conspiracy world. It's something like Dunning-Kruger effect, I think, is sometimes weaponized to try and like make people feel stupid about themselves. Like,
Hmm.
you're just exercising the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it's something that we all do. We all have something that
Sure.
we're super confident in. And but I think conspiracies are, and those who participate in them avidly are I guess a clearer example of that in action.
Yeah.
And for example, I was talking to someone who vehemently believed that there might actually be a hollow earth and there's something to that, and that it's just being hidden from us, but had
Hmm.
developed quite confidently a very elaborate
Hmm.
understanding of how that could possibly exist.
Sure.
And he was so confident in it, in fact, that uh, he had a hard time seeing where a lot of his own arguments kind of broke down. And
Sure.
while that's an obvious thing, I always point things back at myself and realize that could be me in ways that I'm not recognizing.
Absolutely.
And I need to be careful about that. Like
Mhm.
that could be me just on a different topic. And I oh no, where do I feel most comfortable, and how do I disrupt that?
Mhm.
Right.
That's a really good point. And so the metaphor I use in class is you can't fill a cup that's already full. So it's a good idea to leave a little bit of space in your cup, right? To always pour in something new. And on the note of the Dunning-Kruger effect, there was a recent study, and I forget the name of it. It escapes me just at the moment, but it was basically the Dunning-Kruger effect applied to racism. And so what it found was they basically asked participants these questions about racism and asked them to reflect on their own, personal biases and this, that, and the other. And they found that they divided people into three categories. One, folks who were very sure, or people who were open about having prejudices and knew that, okay, well, yeah, I am kind of this way about certain things. People who were not sure but were receptive, and then folks who were very sure that they were not prejudiced. And what they found was the group who was very sure that they were not racist, that they had very egalitarian views, were about as hard to convince of their own prejudices as the folks who were even like, yeah, okay, well, I mean, the world just is what it is, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, it turns out that the folks who were very sure in their own egalitarian mindset that, oh, I'm not a racist, I couldn't be racist, this and the other, I don't have a prejudice bone in my body. They were absolutely like among the hardest people to convince otherwise, that they were in fact engaging in prejudice and racist behavior and perspectives, even when it was proven that they were there, right? That those perspectives were being held by those individuals through like implicit bias testing and things like that. So yeah, it's when you become sure of a thing, and when you cease to have that reflexivity, that internal eye, against the ideas that you've held and that sort of thing, it's tough. It's tough to know how sure you should be of certain things, because on some level you have to have principles and moral standings and all that kind of stuff. So it's difficult and it's painful. The human mind runs away from uncertainty. We don't like it. So yeah, I get it. Yeah. So maybe the world's flat. I don't know. Maybe I should be more open-minded. I'm kidding. That's not. I'll die on that hill. The world is round.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is something that I think is why I gravitate towards filmmaking in general, is it forces me to infuse myself in a topic that ends up changing how I see myself as well. And with that, I this was definitely one that had me like, do I know things? Do I know anything? What do I know? Is there can we,
Yeah. Can we even know things?
Yeah. Can we know things?
Right?
What's the study of that? It's in philosophy, our ability to know truth. What I don't remember the term. Epistemology. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, this film really did become kind of a study in epistemology for myself, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
I feel like
maybe we're all just brains in jars responding to external stimuli. Yeah.
the 14-year-old deep thought about how we might all be in a VR machine of some sort, and someone takes the goggles off of us. Yeah. So
I want my money back if that's the case. I demand it. Whoever's running this virtual simulation is like on some kind of drug trip and their kid is taken over, and I want my money back.
Well, I think on that note, let's go ahead and switch over to the film, and we can continue discussing it after the fact. Now, I understand correctly, this is your first time seeing it yourself, right?
Yes.
Cool. So in part, maybe this will be kind of a reaction video of Gabriel Cruz, and we'll see what he says.
Right.
But afterwards, we'll talk a little bit more about the film itself. So let's go ahead and head over that way. We are back. We have We have an opportunity for first thoughts. Dr. Cruz,
Yes.
tell me.
So, uh, that was interesting. And I know that's kind of a catch-all term for a lot of this stuff, but no, that was really interesting for a couple different reasons. And one that I want to get into is, why was this gentleman so interested, all the time and the energy and the emotional investment in this particular cause? Like, what was his why this? Like, what gap? And I'm assuming a little bit here, but what gap did that fill in his life?
Yeah, so to some extent, I lightly touch on that in the film when allowing him to talk about his early education and development. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he presents it as like, look, I'm not an idiot here. I
Sure.
performed well in school my entire life. I went to West Point. I qualified for West Point and attended. And he doesn't go into it. And he actually was not terribly interested in spending a lot of time talking about his time at West Point, on camera, anyways. But that was an interesting thing that I found revelatory, was that kind of becomes the hinge point in the direction change in his life. Like leading up to that, he according to him, provided he's a reliable narrator, he was very patriotic, very ready to join the military, and eventually had desires to become an astronaut.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes on this course and works very hard. I mean, I nobody just like walks into West Point unless they're an
Sure.
heir to some, I don't want to go there, but like he had to work tooth and nail to get into this institution that he saw as the gatekeeper to this life that he wanted, a life that's dedicated to the country that he loves, a life that's dedicated to serving people in his community, but also the larger idea of America and spreading justice and truth throughout the world, right? That kind of ideological perspective. And he gets to West Point to find that I'm just part of this machine, and
Mm-hmm.
I I'm not going to get this grand. I his expectations. Well, I'm not going to add too much of a narrative to what he feels like his thoughts were, but
Mm-hmm.
it was clear to me through his narrative that his expectations were not met, and
Sure.
that he felt somewhat deceived. That
Sure.
as he talks about it, the theater of war became apparent, and that the powers that be did not share his vision of America, but fed him that vision in order to get his loyalty, his power, his body, right, to conscript into this army, and to become a force for spreading what they wanted, as opposed to something that he felt was inherently good about his country. And so he ends up leaving West Point, which is not a traditional trauma in any sense, but definitely for him changes a lot about his outlook on life. You know, you work your
Sure.
entire life up to this moment, sacrificing quite a bit of time and energy to get there, only to find that it's not what you thought it was. He had to reevaluate his priorities quite drastically, and
Sure.
becomes the lens from which he views everything. And so September 11th, from my discussions with him, was the next big turning point for him, where he saw it, and he saw the response the United States made, and saw the propaganda machine starting to roll, and using this as a way to really perpetuate the narrative that he was believing in so much of his life. That really turned him on to, and obviously that becomes its own conspiracy theory
Sure.
in itself, right? And so it kind of compounds on itself. That led to the fake moon landing conspiracy, and that led to flat Earth, and here he is now.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. The idea of becoming disillusioned with a major philosophical pillar in one's life, I can certainly appreciate how that would make someone want to, I wouldn't say want, because that might sound wrong, but might motivate someone to look for answers and increase skepticism, right? Because hey, if you're wrong here, what else have you been wrong about? And that's an important part of the developing of a critical consciousness, right? Of becoming more thoughtful and being more intentional about, you know, the media that one consumes or the information, and trusting facts and experts and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it seems like he sort of went in another direction. I would say perhaps a counterproductive one. And I didn't get the impression that he was, you know, an idiot or anything like that. I mean, the guy is clearly very driven and dogged. I would question his methodologies. And one of the things that sort of stood out to me was when he was using the telescope and the carpenter's level. So my dad's a carpenter, and I worked with him for years. And whenever you use a carpenter level, if like you're measuring a wall, you use it at multiple points, right? Because if a piece of wood is warped, it's flat on one end and warped at another. Well, holding it just on the flat end won't tell you like that the whole thing is straight, right? You have to use the level, you know, at different spaced intervals throughout the thing to make sure that it's right. Oh, and by the way, that level will tell you if it's if the wood is correct in terms of its vertical orientation, but not its lateral, right? So it's side to side. It could be warped, and you still couldn't tell that just from the flat piece of wood. So this idea of epistemology and, you know, how he's learning, what he's learning, and how interesting it is, and that's fascinating to me because as we talk about in my classes, we can all perceive the same thing and view it very differently, and quite legitimately so, right? The example I like to use is color. So you and I, for example, when we look at the sky, we see blue, right? On a clear day, the sky is blue. But if you are the one in, I think it's like 1 in 100 people who has a fourth cone in their eye, right? Ordinarily, we have 3 cones that are color receptors and help us interpret. Right. But if you have a tetrachromatic eye, you'll see a slight tinge of pink in a clear blue sky, right? And that's part of why we can't use eyesight to like verify these things, because we perceive things differently. Or if I'm not wearing my glasses and I say, well, it all looks blurry to me. Why is it such a foggy day? Right? That's not right. That's not helpful.
The same thing exists with taste, right? Cilantro being the really easy example to bring.
Don't you talk bad about cilantro. I'll fight you on this, Barry. No, I'm sorry. Continue.
You know what I'm talking about, though, right? Like there is a gene that has been identified quite clearly that if you have that specific gene, you cannot stand, or I don't know, I'm not one of those people. I'm with you. I like cilantro. Cilantro is legitimate. It will always have its place and should remain there. But those who have this gene do not like it because it tastes drastically different than someone who lacks that gene. And so their perception of, in this case, a very specific vegetable, herb, what is plant? We'll call it a plant.
Call it a plant. I'm not a scientist, Barry.
But sorry, doctor. But to your point, that our perception of things changes based on our perspective, and how that perspective is positioned based on a number of factors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even that perception can change over time, right? Using the same instrument of human sensory. So I thought that was really interesting. And I have to wonder, what is the gratification purely vindication? Like he wants to be right in this way?
You know,
what's the payoff here?
I feel, yeah, that's a good question. And one that I feel really underqualified, even though I spent a long time with him, and countless hours off camera and countless hours on camera that didn't make it into the film, talking about how he felt about things, why he does what he does, and the extent at which he believes things, or knows things, as he points out in the film. And so even after all that, I hate to just like point down specifically, like this is specifically, but a trend that I've noticed is that conspiracy theorists in general, I mean, again, assuming that we all kind of participate in this conspiratorial thinking process to some level, but like to those who, participate in that thinking to a greater extent, I've noticed that there is kind of an individualism mentality that's taken to an extreme as well, that like, not only am I my own person that can think, breathe, and do as I wish, and that the traditional individualism type ideological perspective that like I am afforded the same opportunities as everyone else. I just have to work hard to get blah, 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 blah. But it's pushed to the extent that I am just as capable as anyone else to know things.
Sure.
But taking that to basically, there is no exclusive knowledge out there. That
right.
The idea that my understanding of things could be limited based on my expertise, as we had already talked about, or a lack of expertise on a given topic, could somehow limit me from knowing what you know, it is preposterous. That the world should be so simplified, and that we should be so adept at being able to interpret it as individuals that it's an offensive idea to even think that maybe I couldn't perceive things correctly, that maybe my perspective is limited in a way that, I brought up specifically, I'll segue into this topic. Another person that I came across in my research was a guy named Donald Hoffman, and he basically he's very public about his research, and he does a TED talk. He talks to reporters all the time. He really likes himself, so he puts himself in the limelight.
Sure.
But one of the things that's interesting is he comes up with this provocative idea that we can't know reality. Like we are not equipped as human beings. Our bodies are not equipped to understand reality for what it is. So his common go-to analogy for this is our computers and how we navigate computers and how they've been developed so that we can navigate them. So you open up your computer, turn it on, and your desktop is there, and you have icons on the screen that you can click on, open up, and you basically can manipulate these icons to navigate to other things, other tools, and so on. But those icons don't actually exist. That's light being emitted from your monitor. Right. Sure. It's not a thing that you are physically interacting with, even though you are given the perception of somehow physically manipulating this icon to then open up a new tool or whatever it might be. And he basically draws that analogy to help us understand what he has concluded, that and his research is far more robust than how I'm presenting it. So
sure.
I am a bad presenter of his research, but basically concluding to some extent that our bodies have evolved to allow us to survive, and our bodies are really good at helping us survive.
Okay.
And so our eyesight is developed so that we can see things that will be an imminent, realistic, common threat to us, and so that we can perceive things that can help sustain our life, right? That our emotions are all driven in that direction towards gravitating towards things that keep us alive, and getting us to run away from things that are going to eat us, or kill us, or maim us, or harm us. Our sex drives are aimed at procreation to perpetuate the species, yada yada yada.
Sure,
whatever it might be, but our body's development to survive does not mean that we get to see reality for what it is, right? Like you had talked about, like we don't get to see all what you were talking about with eyesight, that like some people's eyesight is slightly different than others because of genetic differences and rods and cones, yada yada. But on top of that, no human eye can actually perceive all wavelengths of light, right?
Sure.
We cannot see it all.
Yet. Sorry, yes.
But we need special instruments and tools to see it. And even then, we only see it through graphic interfaces or interpretations presented through other means, like other colors that we can perceive and such. Heat maps are a wonderful expression of that. We cannot see heat waves, but those heat waves can be interpreted through colors and graphical interfaces that we can perceive them, but we're still not seeing reality, right? And so I presented that to Patrick, and that was one of our shorter discussions, actually, because he said, well, like, that doesn't make any sense, because what's the point? Like, what's the point of any of us if we can't know things? And he wasn't very interested.
That took a turn.
It wasn't very interested in continuing on that train of thought, because it didn't serve any purposes for what he was going out for. Because I mean, he's basing everything off of the assumption that he can know some things, if not everything, right? And and so that's one of the more interesting things for me, is like, okay, this gets us somewhere that I don't know. We have to assume certain things in order for some of these conspiracies to work out. Now, hold on real quick. We have a question from Nick that let's explore, and then we'll move on from there. He asked, what made you decide to shoot this doc about him, Patrick, specifically? Why? How'd you meet him? So Patrick is a resident of a town called Denton in Texas. It's just northwest of Dallas. And it's also, Denton, Texas is also home to University of North Texas, where I was going to school for my master's at the time. And so he is a notorious figure in this small college town, and a provocateur, if you will. And really, like, you had to work hard not to know about this guy. There had been a number of news articles on him. A few students had recorded some videos with him, but very informally. And so I just saw the opportunity. I was fascinated with the topic, and I saw it starting to trend. We hadn't quite gotten to the point where NBA basketball players were espousing flat Earth views yet, but like, it was starting to become a fixture in the zeitgeist. So I was like, okay, I got to jump on this. And so, I mean, I hadn't committed to interviewing him yet, and I jumped down that rabbit hole. Like, going online and typing in flat Earth is one of the most fascinating and or dangerous experiences of anyone's life, on the internet anyways, because that leads to all sorts of places, and to a world where that in itself, the flat Earth online world, you cannot know what is true. You can't know, I mean, you can't know how authentic the personalities are that are presenting this information. And the flat earther community online knows that. And they constantly have infighting issues where, like, people are always calling each other out as being plants from government agencies and so on. Like, you're a NASA plant, or, and so, like, just trying to make sense of that, I couldn't put the topic down once I realized, like, oh man, like, nobody knows anything about anything here, and yet everyone thinks they know everything about everything. This is fantastic. This is a wonderful world to research. So I kind of had to do something on that, and I just cold called him. I mean, I Googled his information and found out where he lived exactly, which wasn't very hard. As you saw, his house, it's hard to miss, but I just wanted to confirm everything before I got into introducing myself with him. And he seemed to be open, at least in the sources that I found, to talking about it with people. So I called him up. He does residential construction projects. So, like, his number was available to me. So I looked him up, called him up, and left a message, and he called me back, and we set up a time to talk. And 4-hour conversation later, we agreed to do a documentary together. And that was That was kind of how it was born anyways. So
Okay.
in his words, that conversation lasted far too long. But I don't know. When I presented the film there at the school, I invited him to be in the audience, and at least there he was very open about how much he liked the film, and he enjoyed the presentation of it. Interestingly enough, though, another flat earther that I had met along the way was also at the screening and was not happy with it, even though it was not happy with Patrick's presentation of flat Earth. He felt that Patrick's presentation was not credible enough, and he didn't do a good job at actually presenting flat Earth. And so it's interesting. Again, like the flat Earth community, as much as they rely on each other's camaraderie, they also have a genuine distrust for each other that kind of bubbles below the surface. So.
Wow. Huh. So actually that kind of gets at something that struck me as a through line through all this stuff.
Yeah.
Going back to his disillusionment with West Point, as well as his the experiments that he conducts throughout the documentary, and what you said just now about the flat earthers and how they critique each other and that kind of thing. There's a profound amount of ego involvement that goes into these conspiracy theories and the ability to process them. And I don't mean that as a slam, because we all have ego involvement in what we do, right? We all want to believe that we're doing something worthwhile and that our lives have meaning, not just intrinsically, but also in the choices that we make that make sense and that kind of thing. But a lot of these conspiracy theories are rooted in the idea that there is no knowledge that is inaccessible to us, like you say, and that the internet has sort of created that bloom of access to information and misinformation. And I'm reminded of a conversation I had with someone regarding something related to medicine, and I was citing research and things like that. I am not that kind of doctor. My doctor is in the social sciences, and this individual had a lot of technical training when it came to like the writing, like manuals for what am I thinking of? Technical manuals for like repairs and things like that, and a lot of mechanical orientation, that sort of thing.
Technical writing, yeah.
Right. A lot of, to use metaphor, a lot of horsepower in the engine, right? A profoundly intelligent individual, and they believed that that's what it took. It was raw intelligence that was going to get you to these answers, right? And with the gentleman in the documentary, clearly has a lot of interest in rigor and a lot of, again, a lot of horsepower in the engine, just not directed in the appropriate way, we would say. And so that's what I have found with a lot of these folks that are in conspiracy theories. Very smart, very driven, very skeptical, but they lack the component of the discipline that comes with the years of research and the self-doubt and the willingness to be humble before the information and readjust everything you have.
Well,
if you want to be good,
and that's interestingly enough, that's I can see him rolling his eyes right now at that statement, only because he feels like he did that. Like,
sure,
he changed his worldview. He's been humble about it, and he's being open about it, right? And in fact, oftentimes conspiracy theorists will engage in. They listen to the criticisms, like what you're providing here, and will use that and turn it around and say, no, see, you're the one adhering to mainstream beliefs. You're the one unwilling to see things differently and to be humble about stuff.
Sure, yeah.
I'm the one that was willing to change when presented new information. Isn't this? And so, I mean, I see memes now that are kind of trending, even like it makes the front page on Reddit all the time, where, and yes, I'm the shameful person that Cruz is the front page of Reddit. Everyone has their sins. That's mine, right? Okay. But I cringe whenever I see the memes of people virtue signaling about, like, hey, if you change your opinion based on new knowledge that you've gained, that's admirable and that's good. And I say, yeah, well,
Yeah.
I agree with the sentiment. Like I'm not disagreeing with the words themselves. It's the application of that, and who's the judge of when we have actually decided that the information was worth changing our opinions about, right?
Yeah.
That's where things get hairy, because we all have different measuring sticks for when that's an appropriate thing to do, and it's just, I think that's why I get so frustrated with this topic, but also why I'm so interested in it as well, because it's complex, and it really there are zero easy answers with this.
Absolutely. No, I understand what you mean, because if you are open to all kinds of new information, you're going to get a lot of garbage in your head, quite honestly, right? I mean, goodness gracious, how do you separate the legitimate knowledge from the, I don't know, Jordan Petersons of the world?
Well, and legitimately, like, everyone can get behind a statement like, when you change your opinion based off of new information, like you're a better person, because anyone can get behind that and say, that's me. I totally do that. Like, I'm humble about this.
That's an easy platitude.
Yeah. It's the harder thing is this discussion of like capital T truth versus lowercase t truth. Like what is it, and what are we grasping for, and how do we measure that? How do we know when we've arrived at it? And how do I know that I'm actually being honest about any of this, right? I have a bias towards my own survival and making myself feel good. And I've been programmed my entire life to avoid things that make me feel icky. And correcting myself feels icky. And
it does.
I can delude myself into thinking that I am changing my opinion based off of true new things that I learned all the time. Like, you know, it's...
But there's also that reason why we have external verification, right? That's why we have a scientific process, right? A scientific method that we're supposed to follow.
Right.
That's why journalism has to have, or it does have guidelines and protocols for how to verify a story and report it ethically.
Right.
That's why we have these things, because on that level, it doesn't matter what my own perspective is, right? We talk about all the time in science about replicability, right? Is this study replicable? In the social sciences, absolutely. One of the things that gets me about like conspiracy theories is that related to the media, when people say, oh, well, the media is brainwashing you and this, that, and the other. If the media knew how to brainwash people, 100% it would. But I'm going to tell you now, for anyone who has ever had that thought that, oh, well, the media is just brainwashing us into thinking things, at best, the research doesn't bear that out, because when we try to replicate these studies, we find free will very hard to predict, right? Any study related to free will is always a matter of percentages, and you could be the 30%, you could be the 70%, and honestly, it might even change depending on the day. But I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit in the weeds and got on the soapbox there for a second. What I'm saying is that's why we have developed and we're continuing to refine these tools that help us to understand, removed from ourselves and our own personal experiences and biases.
Well, and on that, I think that's ultimately the larger conclusion that I drew. The conclusion that I can draw from this without getting stuck in this whole, like, can we know anything really? You know, those annoying existential questions, is that I think some people, especially with Flat Earth, like a lot of people either watch this film and when I've presented it, either people have reacted horrified and just aghast at like the audacity of this man, you know, proposing these ideas and sharing them. And in turn, that gets flipped on me as well, which I'm fine with, because that like there is an ethical dilemma when actually making a film of this nature about this guy, because I am inherently one of his tools for publicity, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I had to grapple with that. But other people will say, well, other people will watch this film and actually think it's hilarious. They'll think it's fun. They'll think it's quirky and whatnot. But mostly under the thought of, which I don't think is much healthier than the, you know, offended thought is like, what's the harm? Like, why are we getting our panties in a bunch over flat earth. Like there's so
Sure,
few
yeah.
of them anyways, and those who believe the earth is flat and actually navigate the world based on those ideas are going to be in power anyways, because it's simply how you navigate the world. So like, why do we care if there's a contingency of people who do this? And my response to that is more so, we have to care, not because these ideas, not because we're worried that we're going to convince everyone on the earth that the earth is actually flat again. Like, I'm not worried about flat earth itself being perpetuated. I'm worried about the ideological method for understanding the world we live in to spread.
Right.
And that the way of thinking, or the extent to which these conspiracy theories promote us to think in this way, it actually breaks apart the fabric of our society, a fabric that is built on a trust for certain people being able to do certain things that I either can't do myself or don't have the time to do, right? Like, I mean, we're getting back to early civilization methodology here, where I'm not a blacksmith. I'm a farmer. As a farmer, I don't have time to do blacksmithing. But as a farmer, I need the skills of blacksmithing to exist, to continue doing what I do at the scale that I do it. I need this person to have these skills, and I need to trust that they know what they're doing. So I'm going to, support them. I'm going to rely on them. I'm not going to scrutinize every teensy weensy little thing and question them and look over their shoulder while they're making my horseshoes. I'm going to, trust that they know what they're doing every time they do it, because they've given me a set of horseshoes in the past that have worked. I'm going to go back to this guy and trust that he can do it a second time. Right.
Sure.
And scaling it to contemporary times, like I cannot navigate the world, and we cannot navigate the world where we distrust each other to the scale that conspiracy theorists are expecting us to distrust each other, right? At some point, I mean, I don't even have the mental bandwidth to pursue the understanding of everything that's going on out there, much less the things that I interact with on a daily basis, right? Like the luxury of trusting institutions to some at least healthy extent is that I don't have to know how to code or to program in order to use a computer. It works, right? Yeah. Like sure. I don't have to be a computer scientist in order to operate a computer. And that accessibility benefits me in a tangible sense, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if I might just add something onto that a little bit, when you talk about, it's not about the flat earther personally, about why we should care and that kind of stuff. But this idea of the phenomenon of a disconnect from understood reality, rooted in skepticism, is very important when we talk about our policymakers, right? That is really important when we talk about, say, for example, the currently with the coronavirus and COVID-19 happening, and the relief that was coming to citizens in the form of $1,200, right? $1,200 that was supposed to last us, I forget what, like 3 months, something along those lines, right? I don't know who that works for, and I don't know who thought, what people need, $1,200 that's going to last them even like 2 months would be silly, right? When I was in graduate school, when I was earning my doctorate, and I lived in a small town in Northwest Ohio where the cost of living was very cheap, 3 months of rent alone, that's no groceries, that's not other bills, that's not nothing. 3 months of rent alone would have been about $1,200, right? And so that disconnect from reality, and that is otherwise made apparent when that reality is being represented through like us measures that other experts have put together, the rejection of that is absolutely important as a fundamental flaw in how people go about, setting, policies that affect the rest of us, right?
Right. I mean, this isn't to say that criticism is bad and we shouldn't question things. No, like we started off this discussion about that, but our criticism needs to be grounded in something, right? And again, the more confidence we have in ourselves, the more likely we're overlooking something about ourselves that limits us from really getting it.
Yeah.
All right.
I agree.
Well, on that note, let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Cool.
Gabriel, thank you so much for enjoying this film of mine. I just needed someone to be here to like it while I'm sitting with them. No,
I won't go that far.
I appreciate the discussion. I think we'll start making this a more regular thing, having you on. I think it'd be fun.
Yeah. Cool. It was a great Barry. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And yeah, it's great.
Well, if people want to follow you or get in contact with you, what's your social media?
Don't. No. You can find me on Twitter at Cruz Critcom, or look up Gabriel Cruz PhD, and you'll find me. But yeah, at Cruz Critcom. I'm pretty sure that's my stuff. You can, just look for me. It's fine.
Just look for him.
Gabriel Cruz PhD at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and so you can find me there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right. Yeah. We'll engage in a few announcements and then we'll be done. These announcements shouldn't be new to you if you've seen prior episodes, but here we go. So first off, I always like to showcase important projects that I think are going on, and especially ones that don't get the type of publicity that I think they should. So let's start off with the Citadel Praise Church and Campus Ministries. The Citadel Praise Church and Campus Ministries is based out of Greensboro, North Carolina, and is engaged in an extended campaign called Justice for the Next Generation that dives deep into our current social upheaval concerning racial injustice. They are traveling across the country to epicenters of conflict, such as Brunswick, Georgia, or Minneapolis, providing a boots-on-the-ground perspective to the conversations we have about police brutality, systemic racism, protests, and civic engagement. In fact, they just engaged in a protest last night here in North Carolina that has received quite a bit of viewership. On this journey, Reverend Greg Drumright and his team have interacted with notable voices in this discussion, such as the parents of Ahmaud Arbery, friends and family of George Floyd, police chiefs, politicians, and more, with striking revelations and information that doesn't make it through the filters of popular media and provides meaningful opportunities to spark dialogue in your home. All this, and they live stream everything as it happens. If you'd like to follow what they're doing, and you should, visit their YouTube channel, and you can find the link in the description of this video, or you can go to my website and you can find it there in the spotlight section. Also, Sergio Almendarez is another filmmaker based out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, currently in the final stages of a film called Her Name Was, a film. The film tells the story of unsolved case of the murder of Shade Schuler, an African-American transgender woman. It documents the ever-growing violence toward the transgender community and the anti-transgender rhetoric and laws that encourage it. Almendarez plans to finish and begin showcasing the film in early 2021. To follow his progress and stay up to date on the film, you can visit his website at almendarezmedia.com. You can find that link in the description of this video as well as my website. All right, with that, I would, again, thank you for joining us for today. Next week, we have another wonderful film lined up for us. It is called Hit Play Because We Can, with Addison Wright, the director. It's a wonderful film, and I hope you join us, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, thanks a lot, and have a good night.